92nd Street Y online media is made possible by the generous support of listeners like you. This program, part of the Unterberg Poetry Center's 75 at 75 project, features Saul Bellow reading from his work. It was recorded on October 10, 1988, before a live audience at New York's 92nd Street Y.
For the first time, I regret that I never thought of running for president. One might as well go to the White House with turnouts like this. My first selection after, by the way, I mustn't forget to thank Lola Zladic for that marvelous introduction, which ended in a key very different from the one I'm going to follow tonight. I'm going to read amusing things, not serious ones. I mean, at least to my mind, they're amusing. It's always a mistake to tell people that you're going to be amusing, because then they're determined not to let you be. But this is I'm going to read from two books. One, the first, Humboldt's Gift, and conclude with a selection from Henderson, the Rain King. These books are in my hands, courtesy of my agent, Harriet Wasserman, so that I didn't have to bring them with me from Chicago. Thank you, Harriet. This passage begins with a description of von Humboldt Fleischer in September 1952, picking up the hero Charlie Citrine on Barrow Street near Cherry Lane, the Cherry Lane Theater. Very different from the young poet with whom I had gone to Hoboken to eat clams, he was now thick and stout. He charged down Barrow Street, the first poet in America with power brakes, he said. He was full of car mystique, but he didn't know how to park. I watched him trying to back into an adequate space. My own theory was that the way people parked had much to do with their intimate self-image and revealed how they felt about their own backsides. Humboldt twice got a rear wheel up on the curb and finally gave up, turning off the ignition. Then, in a checked sports jacket and strap-fastened polo boots, he came out swinging shut a door that seemed 2 yards long. His greeting was silent. The large lips were closed. His gray eyes seemed more widely separated than ever. The surfaced whale beside a dory. His handsome face had thickened and deteriorated. It was sumptuous. It was Buddhistic, but it was not tranquil. So, from the present, I see two odd dolls in the front seat of the roaring, grinding four-holer. This Buick was all over mud and looked like a staff car from Flanders Field. The wheels were out of line. The big tires pounded eccentrically. Through the thin sunlight of early autumn, Humboldt drove fast, taking advantage of the Sunday emptiness of the streets. He was a terrible driver, making left turns from the right side, spurting, then dragging, tailgating. I disapproved. Of course, I was much better with a car, but comparisons were absurd because this was Humboldt, not a driver. Steering, he was humped huge over the wheel. He had small boy tremors of the hands and feet. He kept the cigarette holder between his teeth. He was agitated, talking away, entertaining, provoking, informing, and snowing me. He hadn't slept last night. He seemed in poor health. Of course, he drank, and he dosed himself with pills, lots of pills. In his briefcase, he carried the Merck manual. It was bound in black like the Bible. He consulted it often. The car walloped the pavement, charging toward the Holland Tunnel. Close to the large form of Humboldt, this motoring giant, in the awful upholstered luxury of the front seat, I felt the ideas and illusions that went with him. He was always accompanied by a swarm, a huge volume of notions. He said how changed the Jersey swamps were even in his lifetime, with roads, dumps, and factories. And what would a Buick like this with power brakes and power steering have meant even 50 years ago? Imagine Henry James as a driver, or Walt Whitman, or Mallarmé. We were off. He discussed machinery, luxury, command, capitalism, technology, mammon, Orpheus, and poetry, the riches of the human heart, America, and world civilization. His task was to put all of this and more together. The car went snoring and squealing through the tunnel and came out in bright sunlight. Tall stacks of filth artillery fired silently into the Sunday sky with beautiful bursts of smoke. The acid smell of gas refineries went into your lungs like a spur. The rushes were as brown as onion soup. There were seagoing tankers stuck in the channels. The wind boomed, the great clouds were white. Far out, the massed New Jersey bungalows had the look of a necropolis to be. Through the pale sun of the streets, the living went to church. Under Humboldt's polo boot, the carburetor gasped. The eccentric tires thumped fast on the slabs of the highway. The gusts were so strong that even the heavy Buick fluttered. We plunged over the Pulaski Skyway, while the stripes of girder shadows came at us through the shuddering windshield. In the back seat were books, bottles, beer cans, and paper bags. Tristan Corbière, I remember, Les Amours Jaunes in a yellow jacket, and the Police Gazette, pink, with pictures of vulgar cops and sinful kitty cats. Humboldt's house was in the New Jersey back country, near the Pennsylvania line. This marginal land was good for nothing but chicken farms. The approaches were unpaved, and we drove in dust. Briars lashed the roadmaster as we swayed on huge springs through rubbishy fields where white boulders sat. The busted muffler was so loud that though the car filled the lane, there was no need to honk. You could hear us coming. Humboldt yelled, "Here's our place," and swerved. We rolled over a hummock or earth wave. The front of the Buick rose and then dived into the weeds. He squeezed the horn, fearing for his cats, but the cats lit out and found safety on the roof of the woodshed, which had collapsed under the snow last winter. Kathleen was waiting in the yard, large, fair-skinned, and beautiful. Her face, in the feminine vocabulary of praise, had wonderful bones. But she was pale, and she had no country color at all. Humboldt said she seldom went outside. She sat in the house reading books. It was exactly like Bedford Street here, except that the surrounding slum was rural. I saw the position into which Humboldt had placed Kathleen, and I put it into words. He was saying, "Lie there, hold still, and don't wiggle. My happiness may be peculiar, but once happy, I will make you happy, happier than you ever dreamed. When I am satisfied, the blessings of fulfillment will flow to all mankind. Wasn't this, I thought, the message of modern power? This was the voice of the crazy tyrant speaking with peculiar lusts to consummate, for which everyone must hold still. I grasped it at once. Then I thought that Kathleen must have secret feminine reasons for going along. I too was supposed to go along. And in another fashion, I too was to hold still. Humboldt had plans for me beyond Princeton. When he wasn't a poet, he was a fanatical schemer, and I was peculiarly susceptible to his influence. Why that was, I have only recently begun to understand. But he thrilled me continually. Whatever he did was delicious. Kathleen seemed aware of this and smiled to herself as I came out of the car. I stood on the down-beaten grass. "Breathe the air," Humboldt said. "Different from Bedford Street, hey?" He then quoted, "This castle hath a pleasant seat. Also, the heaven's breath smells wooingly here." We then started to play football. He and Kathleen played all the time. This was why the grass was trampled. Kathleen spent most of the day reading, for to understand what her husband was talking about, she had to catch up, she said, on James, Proust, Edith Wharton, Karl Marx, Freud, and so on. "I have to make a scene to get her out of the house for a little football," said Humboldt. She threw a very good pass, a hard, accurate spiral. Her voice trailed as she ran bare-legged and made the catch on her breast. The ball in flight wagged like a duck's tail. It flew under the maples, over the clothesline. After confinement in the car and in my interview clothes, I was glad to play. Humboldt was a heavy, choppy runner, and in their sweaters, he and Kathleen looked like two rookies, big, fair, padded out. Humboldt said, "Look at Charlie jumping like Nijinsky." I was as much Nijinsky as his house was Macbeth's castle. The crossroads had eaten into the small bluff the cottage sat on, and it was beginning to tip. By and by, they'd have to prop it up. "Or sue the county," said Humboldt. He'd sue anybody. The neighbors raised poultry on this slummy land: burdocks, thistles, dwarf oaks, cottonweed, chalky holes, and whitish puddles everywhere. It was all pauperized. The very bushes might have been on welfare. Across the way, the chickens were throaty. They sounded like immigrant women. And the small trees, oaks, sumacs, ailanthus, were underprivileged, dusty, orphan-looking. The autumn leaves were pulverized, and the fragrance of leaf decay was pleasant. The air was empty but good. As the sun went down, the landscape was like the still frame of an old movie on sepia film. Sunset, a red wash spreading from remote Pennsylvania, sheep bells clunking, dogs in brown barnyards. I was trained in Chicago to make something of such a scant setting. In Chicago, you become a connoisseur of the near nothing. With a clear eye, I looked at a clear scene. I appreciated the red sumac, the white rocks, the rust of the weeds, the wig of green on the bluff over the crossroads. It was more than appreciation. It was already an attachment. It was even love. The influence of a poet probably contributed to the feeling for this place that developed so quickly. I'm not referring to the privilege of being admitted to the literary life, though there may have been a touch of that. No, the influence was this. One of Humboldt's themes was the perennial human feeling that there was an original world, a home world, which we had lost. Sometimes he spoke of poetry as the Ellis Island, where a host of aliens began their naturalization, and of this planet as a thrilling but insufficiently humanized imitation of that home world. He spoke of our species as castaways. But good old peculiar Humboldt, I thought, and I was peculiar enough in my own right, now has taken on the challenge of challenges. You needed the confidence of genius to commute between this patch, nowhere, New Jersey, and the home world of our glorious origin. And why did the crazy son of a bitch have to make things so hard for himself? He must have bought this joint in a blaze of mania, but now running far into the weeds to catch the waggle-tailed ball as it flew over the clothesline in the dusk. I was really very happy. I thought, maybe he can swing it. Perhaps, being lost, one should get loster. Being very late for an appointment, it might be best to walk slower, as one of my beloved Russian writers advised. I was dead wrong. It wasn't a challenge, and he wasn't even trying to swing it. When it grew too dark to play, we went inside. The house was Greenwich Village in the fields. It was furnished from thrift shops, rummage sales, and church bazaars, and seemed to rest on a foundation of books and papers. We sat in the parlor, drinking from peanut butter glasses. Big, fair, wan, lovely, pale-freckled Kathleen, with that buoyant bust, gave kindly smiles, but mostly she was silent. Wonderful things are done by women for their husbands. She loved a poet king and allowed him to hold her captive in the country. She sipped beer from a Pabst can. The room was low-pitched. Husband and wife were large. They sat together on the Castro sofa. There wasn't enough room on the wall for their shadows. They overflowed onto the ceiling. The wallpaper was pink, the pink of ladies' underclothing or chocolate creams, in a rose and lattice pattern. Where a stovepipe had once entered the wall, there was a gilt-edged asbestos plug. The cats came and glared through the window, humorless. Humboldt and Kathleen took turns letting them in. There were old-fashioned window pins to pull. Kathleen laid her chest to the panes, lifting the frame with the heel of her hand and boosting also with her bosom. The cats entered, bristling with night static. Poet, thinker, problem drinker, pill taker, man of genius, manic depressive, intricate schemer, success story. He once wrote poems of great wit and beauty. But what had he done lately? Had he uttered the great words and songs he had in him? He had not. Unwritten poems were killing him. He had retreated to this place, which sometimes looked like Arcadia to him and sometimes looked like hell. Here, he heard the bad things being said of him by his detractors, other writers and intellectuals. He grew malicious himself, but seemed not to hear what he said of others, how he slandered them. He brooded and intrigued fantastically. He was becoming one of the big-time solitaries. And he wasn't meant to be a solitary. He was meant to be in active life, a social creature. His schemes and projects revealed this. At this time, he was sold on Adlai Stevenson. He thought that if Adlai could beat Ike in the November election, culture would come into its own in Washington. Now that America is a world power, he said, Philistinism is finished. Finished and politically dangerous, he said. If Stevenson is in, literature is in. We're in, Charlie. Stevenson reads my poems. How do you know that? I'm not free to tell you how. But I'm in touch. Stevenson carries my ballads with him on the campaign trail. Intellectuals are coming up in this country. Democracy is finally about to begin creating a civilization in the USA. That's why Kathleen and I left the village. He had become a man of property now. Moving into the barren backlands among the hillbillies, he felt that he was entering the American mainstream. That, at any rate, was his cover. But because there were other reasons for the move, jealousy, sexual delusions, he told me once a long and tangled story. Kathleen's father had tried to get her away from him, from Humboldt. Before they were married, the old man had taken her and sold her to one of the Rockefellers. She disappeared one day, said Humboldt, said she was going to the French bakery, and was gone for almost a year. I hired a private detective, but you can guess what kind of security arrangements the Rockefellers with their billions would have. There are tunnels under Park Avenue. Which of the Rockefellers bought her? Bought is the word, said Humboldt. She was sold by her father. So never again smile when you read about white slavery in the Sunday supplement. I suppose it was all against her will. She's very pliant. You see what a dove she is, 100% obedient to that vile old man. He said, go, and she went. Maybe that was her real pleasure, which her pimp father only authorized. Masochism, of course. This was part of the psyche game which Humboldt had studied under its modern masters, a game far more subtle and rich than any patented parlor entertainment. Out in the country, Humboldt lay on his sofa reading Proust, pondering the motives of Albertine. He seldom allowed Kathleen to drive to the supermarket without him. He hid the ignition key from her and kept her in Purda. He was a handsome man still. Kathleen adored him. He, however, suffered keen Jewish terrors in the country. He was an Oriental, she a Christian maiden, and he was afraid. He expected the KKK to burn a cross in his yard or shoot at him through the window as he lay on the Castro sofa reading Proust or inventing scandal. Kathleen told me that he looked under the hood of the Buick for booby traps. More than once, Humboldt tried to get me to confess that I had similar terrors about my friend, Demi Vongel. A neighboring farmer had sold him green logs. These smoked in the small fireplace as we sat after dinner. On the table was the stripped skeleton of a turkey. The wine and beer were going fast. There was an Ann Page coffee cake and melting maple walnut ice cream. A slight cesspool smell rose to the window. And the scale gas cylinders resembled silver artillery shells. Humboldt was saying that Stevenson was a man of real culture, the first really since Woodrow Wilson. But Wilson was inferior in this respect to Stevenson and Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln knew Shakespeare well and quoted him at the crises of his life. There's nothing serious in mortality, all is but toys. Duncan is in his grave. After life's fitful fever, he sleeps well. These were Lincoln's premonitions just as Lee was about to surrender. Frontiersmen were never afraid of poetry. It was big business with its fear of femininity. It was the unicoid clergy capitulating to vulgar masculinity that made religion and art sissy things. Stevenson understood that. If you could believe Humboldt, and I couldn't. Stevenson was Aristotle's great-souled man. In his administration, cabinet members would quote Yeats and Joyce. The new Joint Chiefs would know Thucydides. Humboldt would be consulted about each State of the Union message. He was going to be the Goethe of the new government and build Weimar in Washington. You be thinking what you might like to do, Charlie. Something in the Library of Congress for a start? Kathleen said, "There's a good program on the Late Late Show, an old Bela Lugosi movie." She saw that Humboldt was overexcited. He wouldn't sleep tonight. Very good. We tuned in the horror picture. Bela Lugosi was a mad scientist who invented synthetic flesh. He daubed it on himself, making a fearful mask. And he broke into the rooms of beautiful maidens who screamed and fell unconscious. Kathleen, more fabulous than scientists, more beautiful than any of the ladies, sat with a hazy, absent, freckled half smile. Kathleen was a somnambulist. Humboldt had surrounded her with the whole crisis of Western culture. So she went to sleep. What else could she do? I understand these decades of sleep. This is a subject I know well. Meantime, Humboldt kept us from going to bed. He took Amitol to overcome the benzodrine, on top of which he drank gin. I went out and walked in the cold. Light poured from the cottage into ruts and gullies over the tangled road crown of wild carrot and ragweed. Yapping dogs, foxes maybe, piercing stars. The late, late spooks jittered through the windows. The mad scientist shot it out with the police. His lab exploded and he died in flames, the synthetic flesh melting from his face. Humboldt and I were up talking half the night. Kathleen lent me a sweater. She saw that Humboldt would sleep very little, and maybe she took advantage of my visit to get a little rest, foreseeing an entire week of manic nights when there would be no guest to spell her. As a foreword to this evening of conversation with von Humboldt-Fleischer, for it was a sort of recital, I would like to offer a succinct historical statement. There came a time, early modern, when apparently life lost the ability to arrange itself. It had to be arranged, and intellectuals took this as their job. From, say, Machiavelli's time to our own, this arranging has been one of the great, gorgeous, tantalizing, misleading, disastrous project. A man like Humboldt, inspired, shrewd, nutty, was brimming over with the discovery that the human enterprise, so grand and infinitely varied, had now to be managed by exceptional persons. He was an exceptional person. Therefore, he was an eligible candidate for power. Well, why not? Whispers of sane judgment plainly told him why not and made this comical. And as long as we were laughing, we were okay. Now, a word about Humboldt's conversation. What was the poet's conversation actually like? He wore the look of a balanced thinker when he began, but he was not the picture of sanity. I myself loved to talk and kept up with him as long as I could. For a while it was a double concerto, but presently I was fiddled and trumpeted off the stage. Reasoning, formulating, debating, making discoveries, Humboldt's voice rose, choked, rose again. His mouth went wide. Dark stains formed under his eyes. His eyes seemed blotted. Arms heavy, chest big, pants gathered with much belt to spare under his belly, the loose end of leather hanging down. He passed from statement to recitative. From recitative, he soared into aria, and behind him there played an orchestra of intimations, virtues, love of his art, veneration of its great men, but also of suspicion and skullduggery. Before your eyes, the man recited and sang himself in and out of madness. He started by talking about the place of art and culture in the first Stevenson administration, his role, our role, for he and I were going to make hay together. He began this with an appreciation of Eisenhower. Eisenhower had no courage in politics. See what he allowed Joe McCarthy and Senator Jenner to say about General Marshall. He had no guts. But he shone in logistics and public relations, and he was no fool. He was the best type of garrison officer, easygoing, a bridge player. He liked girls and read Zane Grey westerns. If the public wanted a relaxed government, if it had recovered sufficiently from the Depression and now wanted a holiday, it felt strong enough to get along without new dealers and prosperous enough to be ungrateful, so it would vote for Ike, the sort of ruler who could be ordered from a Sears Roebuck catalog. Maybe it had had enough of great personalities like FDR and energetic men like Truman, but he didn't wish to underrate America. Stevenson might make it. Now we would see where art would go in a liberal society and whether it was compatible with social progress. Meantime, having mentioned Roosevelt, Humboldt hinted that FDR might have had something to do with the death of Bronson Cutting, Senator Cutting's plane having crashed while he was flying from his home state after a vote recount. How did it happen? Maybe J. Edgar Hoover was involved. Hoover kept his power by doing the dirty work of presidents. Remember how he tried to damage Burton Wheeler of Montana. From this, Humboldt turned to Roosevelt's sex life. Then from Roosevelt and J. Edgar Hoover to Lenin and Dzerzhinsky of the Gay Payou, then back to Sejanus and the origins of secret police in the Roman Empire. Next, he spoke of Trotsky's literary theories and how heavy a load great art made in the baggage train of the revolution. Then he went back to Ike and the peacetime life of professional soldiers in the 30s and the drinking habits of the military and Churchill and the bottle and the confidential arrangements to protect the great from scandal and security measures in the male brothels of New York and alcoholism and homosexuality and the married and domestic lives of pederasts. Late at night, Humboldt read military history and war memoirs. He knew Wheeler Bennett, Chester Wilmot. He knew Hitler's generals. He also knew Walter Winchell and Earl Wilson and Leonard Lyons and Red Smith, and he moved easily from the tabloids to General Rummel and from Rummel to John Donne and T.S. Eliot. And this rained down on me, part privilege, part pain, with illustrations from the classics and the sayings of Einstein and Zsa Zsa Gabor, with references to Polish socialism and the football tactics of George Halas and the secret motives of Arnold Toynbee, and somehow, I don't know how this got in, the used car business. Well, you can see for yourself, Charlie, said Humboldt after more of this, how important it is for the Stevenson administration to have a cultural advisor like me who understands this world process somewhat. Above us, Kathleen was getting into bed. Our ceiling was her floor. The boards were bare, and you heard every movement. I rather envied her. I was now shivering and would have liked to get under the covers myself. But Humboldt was telling me that we were only 15 minutes from Trenton and 2 hours from Washington by train, so we could shoot right in. He confided that Stevenson had already been in touch with him and that a meeting was being arranged. Humboldt asked me to help him prepare notes for this conversation, and until 3 a.m, we discussed it. Then I went to my room and left Humboldt pouring himself a last cup of gin. Next day, he was still going strong. It made me giddy to hear so much subtle analysis and to have so much world history poured over my head at breakfast. He hadn't slept at all. To calm himself, he took a run. With slovenly shoes, he pounded the gravel, waist high in dust, his arms bunched against his chest. He descended the road. He seemed to sink down into it under the sumacs and small oaks, between banks of brittle crabgrass, thistle, milkweed, puffballs. Burrs were sticking to his pants when he returned. For running too, he had a text. When Jonathan Swift was secretary to Sir William Temple, he ran miles every day to blow off steam. He took me for a stroll, and the cats accompanied us through the dead leaves and brush. They practiced pouncing. They attacked ground gossamers. With grenadier tails, they bounded to sharpen their claws on trees. Humboldt was extremely fond of them. The morning air was infused with something very nice. Humboldt went in and shaved, and then we drove in the fateful Buick to Princeton. The second selection is from Henderson, the Rain King, and it's from the very end of the novel. And Henderson is on his way home carrying a lion which he believes to be the reincarnation of his friend, the late king. So they're flying, and the stewardess comes to Henderson and says, "There's a little kid on the plane. He'd probably adore a lion cub. He looks pretty sad." And I said, "Who is it?" "Well, his parents were Americans. There's a letter around his neck that tells the story. This kid doesn't speak English at all, only Persian." "Go on," I said to her. "The father worked for oil people in Persia. The kid was raised by Persian servants. Now he's an orphan and going to live with grandparents in Carson City, Nevada. At Idlewild, I'm supposed to turn him over to somebody." "Poor little bastard," I said. "Why don't you bring him and we'll show him the line?" So she fetched the boy. He was very white and wore short pants with strap garters and a little dark green sweater. He was a black-haired boy like my own. The kid went to my heart. You know how it is when your heart drops, like a fall-bruised apple in the cold morning of autumn. "Come here, little boy," I said, and reached for the child's hand. "It's bad business," I told the stewardess, "to ship a little kid around the world alone." I took the cub and gave it to him. I don't think he knows what it is. He probably imagines it's a kitty. But he likes it. As a matter of fact, the animal did lighten the boy's melancholy, so we let them play. And when we went back to our seats, I kept him with me and tried to show him pictures in the magazine. I gave him his dinner, and at night he fell asleep in my lap, and I had to ask the girl to keep her eye on the lion for me. I couldn't move now. She said he was asleep too. And during this leg of the flight, my memory did me a great favor. Yes, I was granted certain recollections, and they have made a sizable difference to me. And after all, it's not all to the bad to have had a long life. Something of benefit can be found in the past. First, I was thinking, take potatoes. They actually belong to the deadly nightshade family. Next, I thought, actually, pigs don't have a monopoly on grunting either. This reflection made me remember that after my brother Dick's death, I went away from home, being already a big boy of about 16, with a mustache, a college freshman. The reason why I left was that I couldn't bear to see the old man mourn. We have a beautiful house, a regular work of art. The foundations are of stone and 3 feet thick. The ceilings are 18 feet. The windows are 12 and start at the floor, so that the light fills everything through that kind of marred, old-fashioned glass. There's a piece that even I haven't been able to destroy in those old rooms. Only one thing is wrong. The joint isn't modern. It's not like the rest of life at all, and therefore it's misleading. And as far as I was concerned, Dick could have had it. But the old man, gushing white beard from all his face, he made me feel our family line had ended with Dick up in the Adirondacks when he shot at the pen and plugged the Greek's coffee urn. Dick also was a curly-headed man with broad shoulders like the rest of us. He was drowned in the wild mountains, and now my dad looked at me and despaired. An old man, disappointed, of failing strength, may try to reinvigorate himself by means of anger. Now I understand it, but I couldn't see it at 16 when we had a falling out. I was working that summer wrecking old cars, cutting them up for junk with a torch. I was lord and master of the wrecked cars at a place about 3 miles from home. It did me good to work in this wrecking yard. That summer, I did nothing but dismantle cars. I was grease and rust all over, and scalded and dazzled with the cutting torch, and I made mountains of fenders and axles and car innards. On the day of Dick's funeral, I went to work too. And in the evening, when I washed myself in the back of the house under the garden hose, I was gasping as the chill water rushed over my head, and the old man came out on the back porch in the dark green of the vines. By the side was a neglected orchard, which later I cut down. The water blurted over me. It was cold as outer space. Fiercely, the old man started to yell at me. The hose bubbled on my head, while inside I was hotter than the cutting torch that I took to all those old death cars from the highway. My father, in his grief, swore at me. I knew he meant it, because he put aside his customary elegance of words. He cursed, I guess, because I didn't comfort him. So I went away. I hitchhiked to Niagara Falls. I reached Niagara and stood looking in. I was entranced by the crash of the water. Water can be very healing. I went on the Maid of the Mists, the old one, since burned, and through the Cave of the Winds and the rest of it. And then I went on up to Ontario and picked up a job in an amusement park. This was most of all what I recalled on the plane. with the head of the American Persian child on my lap, the North Atlantic leading its black life beneath us as the 4 propellers were fanning us homeward. It was Ontario, though I don't remember which part of the province. The park was a fairground, too, and Hanson, the guy in charge, slept me in the stables. There, the rats jumped back and forth over my legs at night and fed on oats, and the watering of the horses began at daybreak in the blue light that occurs at the end of darkness in high latitudes. The Negroes came to the horses at this blue time of the night when the damp was heavy. I worked with Smolak. I had almost forgotten this animal, Smolak, an old brown bear whose trainer, also Smolak, he had been named for him, had beat it with the rest of the troop and left him on Hanson's hands. There was no need of a trainer. Smolak was too old, and his master had dusted him off. This ditched old creature was almost green with time and down to his last teeth, like the pits of dates. For this shabby animal, Hanson had thought up a use. He had been trained to ride a bike, but now he was too old. Now he could feed from a dish with a rabbit, after which, in a cap and bib, he drank from a baby bottle while he stood on his hind legs. But there was one more thing, and this is where I came in. There was a month yet to the end of the season, and every day of this month, Smolak and I rode on a roller coaster together before large crowds. This poor, broken, ruined creature and I, alone, took high rides twice a day. And while we climbed and dipped and swooped and swerved and rose again higher than the Ferris wheels and fell, we held on to each other. By a common bond of despair, we embraced cheek to cheek as all support seemed to leave us, and we started down the perpendicular drop. I was pressed into his long-suffering, age-worn, tragic, and discolored coat as he grunted and cried to me. At times the animal would wet himself, but he was apparently aware that I was his friend, and he didn't claw me. I took a pistol with blanks in case of an assault. It never was needed. I said to Hanson, as I recall, "We're two of a kind. Smolak was cast off, and I'm an Ishmael too." As I lay in the stable, I would think about Dick's death and about my father, but most of the time I lived not with horses, but with Smolak, and this poor creature and I were very close. So before pigs ever came on my horizon, I received a deep impression from a bear. So, if corporeal things are an image of the spiritual, and visible objects are renderings of invisible one, and if Smolak and I were outcasts together, two humorists before the crowd, but brothers in our souls, I enbeared by him and he probably humanized by me, I didn't come to pigs as a tabula rasa. It only stands to reason. Something deep already was inscribed on me. Once more, whatever gains I ever made were always due to love and nothing else. And as Smolak, mossy like a forest elm, and I rode together, and as he cried out at the top, beginning the bottomless rush over those skimpy yellow supports, and up once more against eternity's blue, all the stuff that's been done within this envelope of color, this subtle bag of life-giving gases, while the Canadian Hicks were rejoicing underneath with red faces, all the nubble-fingered rubes, we hugged each other, the bear and I, with something greater than terror, and flew in those gilded cars. I shut my eyes in his wretched, time-abused fur. He held me in his arms and gave me comfort. And the great thing is that he didn't blame me. He had seen too much of life, and somewhere in his huge head, he had worked it out, that for creatures, there is nothing that ever runs unmingled. Thank you. Now the lights are going to go on and your questions are going to be collected. It'll be something like a lottery because I will never have seen them before. It'll be like drawing numbers for the draft. Do you believe in angels? Was Delmore Schwartz Humboldt an angel? Well, it was Humboldt Delmore that helped to convince me that there were such things. You opened by suggesting that perhaps you should be running for president. I can't. I'm Canadian-born. It's impossible. I, for one, am glad you're not. You have a much more important role. What do you think is the writer's role in society? If I were editor of the Reader's Digest, I might devote a few issues of the magazine to this. Well, I'm glad I'm not running for president either. Sometimes I think this country doesn't need a president. It hasn't had one for about 12 years. What do I think the writer's role is? I think the writer's role is to provide the best books he can for people who read and who like to read. And I think that's about it. I don't know what else he can do, since most people think, because, except for the very rich writers, most writers are just idiots with pens or word processor. Wimps with word processors. What do I think my particular contribution has been? Well, I don't know what my, I remember people in the old days used to think that if they scuffed their feet in the right way, they could slow the revolution of the planet a little bit. I often feel that way myself. How much of your writing comes as a dream? Well, I often, when I'm writing something, I often have mingled night thoughts and dreams, especially toward morning, when evidently I begin to think about what I'm going to do after I've had my coffee. But that's most important because I'm quite a spectacular dreamer, and I have some very rich dreams, and of course one does forget them, but I make it a point to think about them and study them through, because I think that they are not just the products of the unconscious or its agent, the id, or is it the other way around, but there is something is trying to tell us the truth. That's the way I feel about it, at any rate. Do you remember Chandler Chapman? I used to live upstate at Rokeby, and someone told me Henderson was based somewhat on him. Well, I think if you wanted to push it, you might find some resemblances, yes. Chandler Chapman was my landlord for a while, and I lived as long as I could, that is, until the freezing weather really began. Then I had to leave the house because there was no heat in it. And it's true that he was a sort of larger-than-life character. How do you expect literature to fare in a Dukakis or Bush administration? Well, that's a question as to which pet food do you prefer, Alpo or Rival? I don't really know. The question is, these are all the questions that pursue and haunt us, that is to say, general questions to which answers can be given, but they're cognitive answers. They're not imaginative answers. And I don't really believe in cognitive answers very much anymore, because I've been so disfigured by my trade that I believe is the real answer, and the cognitive answer is just more material for newspapers and magazines, or even learned journals. So I take a strange view of these things. I'd feel better about any administration if, first of all, if the candidates spoke English better and more clearly. And secondly, if they didn't fill the air with all kinds of euphemisms and meaningless terms and organize themselves in organizing short declarative sentences containing words that I don't understand, like reaching out, or dialogue, or my perception is this, my perception is that. I always thought perception was a technical term from psychology. Am I politically active? Well, I sometimes take a keen interest in what's happening in the city of Chicago, which is a sort of dream zoo where the bars are not always in place. Do you read contemporary poets? Which ones? Well, I do read contemporary poets. I always have. All the members of my generation read contemporary poets because they had Eliot and Stevens and Pound and Frost to read, and then they got into the habit of reading the others as they came along. So of course I do. Do you have any role models? Well, role model is one of those words that that you hear in the speeches of politicians. I like roll mops better. Of your own novels, which is your favorite? Well, the one I love best is always the one I'm writing now. And the reason for that is that I feel that I'm still allowed to, by the gods, to correct previous mistakes. Because what I mostly see when I read one of my old books is where I goofed. Which, well, okay. What have been the greatest influences on you? I don't know. If you ran for president, whom would you choose for vice president? You see? Well, my first requirement would be some non-zombie. I was really genuine. I do watch politics. Crazy for any American to say that he doesn't, even if he writes novels. And I kept wondering why George Bush had chosen Senator Quayle. And then I thought, well, it was an outburst of class loyalty. he was really saying, look here, it's not just one rich boy who's going to be on the ticket, but two, and there's good reason for it. Now, I have no objection to rich men. FDR was a rich man. The country didn't want anybody but this Dutchess County squire. When things were at their worst in my memory in this country, they wanted a Hudson Valley aristocrat with a cigarette holder and a Harvard drawl to govern them. So it's not that I'm against people on any class basis. I am not. I'm not the one with the class feeling. I think that Bush seems to have had it. Please tell us about your first decision to be a writer. What was your earliest experience as a writer? Well, when I was 4 years old, I was obliged to start reading the Old Testament in Hebrew. And that, I must say, had a decisive influence on me. Then I was... At the age of 8, I was in the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal for about 4 months. And what I had to read were either the funny papers or the Bible, the New Testament, because ladies from the Bible Society would come around. Their mission was ostensibly to keep up your reading so you didn't slide back at school. But I read the New Testament when I was 8 years old. This was my first exposure to it. I was deeply moved by the Gospels and also stricken with guilt. That my only excuse was that I was in the hospital. But I think by the time of 11 or 12, by the time I was 11 or 12 years old, I knew pretty well that I wished to be a writer. And since I had the good luck to be an adolescent during the Depression, there was nothing to prevent me from being one. Because when my family said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, here's so-and-so who's an accountant, so-and-so who's a dentist, and other people are engineers and so on. And they're working in the streets for WPA, so what's the point of my studying any of these professions?" This was a great help to me. My first attempts, I can give you an example of this. I gave a story to Miss Lucy Pope, who was my sophomore or junior English teacher in high school. And she took me to the principal and accused me of having plagiarized it. I had written it with strong emotions and great feelings, day and night, and given it to her with pride. And so the principal said I would have to bring my parents. My parents had a policy never to appear in school when the kids were in trouble. They said, "We have enough trouble feeding you and keeping you clothed, and we're not going to go down to talk to the principal in broken English." And so I had the presence of mind to say, "Well, if Miss Pope thinks I copied the story, why doesn't she produce the story that I copied?" And this dissolved the case, and it was my first victory as a writer. Why did you decide to dedicate your life to writing? And what sacrifices did that entail? Well, I made the decision before I knew what I was doing, and then when I found how difficult it was, I was stubborn enough not to quit, and I made every sacrifice that was necessary. And when I was down in the village in my 20s and part of my 30s, people used to say to each other proudly, "It only costs $1,000 a year to be poor." And then we could patch that together by writing unsigned review paragraphs for the New Republic or the New York Times. And the book editor at the New York Times was a very kindly man, and when he saw you looking pretty lousy when you came in with your $5 review, he would take some review copies off the shelf and give them to you. You could go and sell them to a man named Carol Cox on East 58th Street, who gave you 1/3 of the jacket price. And then you could eat for a few days. Of course, rent was only about $3 a week. This is a nice one. If you could tint your writer with 5% of another writer's work, who would you choose? And what would it add to the meaning of your work? Well, if there's anything that gives a writer despair, it's that he knows he can't go to the supermarket and get some tincture to put in. He doesn't. He only holds before him the great writers and the masterpieces they wrote, and hopes that he will perhaps be remembered. But he can't be sure of that either, so it's a terrific gamble, and there's absolutely no insurance that you can take out against this. Congratulations, Killer Bee. This is an echo of what is happening at Stanford University. I am listed among the killer bees, with the other one being Mr. Bloom and Mr. Bennett, and that we are against the third world and against expanding the concept of a liberal education. I'm not at all opposed to anything in the third world. I may myself be a representative of the third world for all I know. Well, the essential books are the ones without which you can't understand the United States, the modern world, and lots of other things that you can't understand. And it's a pity to dismiss them. And I'm going to be a dead white male myself pretty soon, so I have a certain sympathy with the others who are... That's about as much as I can do.
Thanks for listening. 92nd Street Y Unterberg Poetry Center webcasts and access to our archive are made possible by the generous support of listeners like you. For more information on 92nd Street Y and all our programs, please visit us on the web at 92y.org. This program is copyright 1988 by 92nd Street Y.